This episode is dedicated to Antonio, Chris Sears, and Yuli for becoming our newest Southpaw supporters and helping to make this project possible. If you can spare a few dollars a month, consider supporting us on Patreon. Not only do you get access to bonus content, but you'll also be supporting this entire project, from research, podcasting, outreach, networking, social media, MMA curriculum, future training collectives, and all of our different online groups. If everyone who follows us were to support us with even $1 a month, this project could actually sustain my living and make this the only thing I do. My co-host Paul was able to keep working throughout the pandemic. However, I was not so fortunate. I also have a family to consider. Many leftist passion projects like this one have disappeared because the creators eventually had to make a financial decision whether to continue or not. The pandemic has only accelerated this timetable. We all know fascists and right-wing chuds who are doing well right now. And many of us, especially in the martial arts, support them by buying and ordering their products, their matches, attending their classes, seminars, and so forth. So if the money is being spent anyway, let's keep that money circulating within the anti-fascist sphere instead. Low-key hating the fash is not the same as actively supporting your comrades. I'm not just talking about myself or Southpaw. There are plenty of others who could use your support. There's actually enough of us to all support one another. We just never thought about it because we're just used to consumerism rather than active mutual support. We're also never going to be as popular as the right in the combat sports space. But we don't need to be. We just need solidarity among the numbers we already have. Sometimes we just need a reminder. Also, many of you were supporting the Sanders campaign every month. Well, he's out of the race, but we're still in the game. So we're once again asking for that financial support instead. I also recognize many of you are also in difficult financial situations. And Paul and I appreciate you following us and telling your friends about us. If that's the only aid you can give, that's more than enough. This is Sam.
This is Mylan.
This is part 2 and the final part of my conversation with Indigenous scholar Mylan Tootoosis. So then going back to even residential schools, the fallout from that is not gaining any of those management skills, right? Those emotional management skills. Like I have a son, and that's something that we're thinking about as parents, like self-regulation, emotional management, right? Emotional intelligence, to your point. All of those things, those schools didn't even give you space to process those things. And then you become an adult and then you have kids and then that carries down through generations. So then somebody who's 3-4 generations down from that, that's a lot of internal decolonization and unpacking to do.
Yeah, totally. Definitely. It's intergenerational, right? And it is a lot of unpacking to do. And the best way to unpack that is through emotional intelligence, right? Through that emotional energy that we're feeling. Because sometimes I get triggered. Like for me, in all honesty, I can't watch Western movies that portray violence on Indigenous people. Like I still won't watch it. And for me, that's a colonial trauma. For me, that's emotional issues, you know. And there are a lot of amazing documentaries come out recently about rewriting those histories. But even for me, like it's still hard for me to sit and watch those documentaries. Because it does elicit an emotional response from me. And again, that is the result of like colonial trauma that exists intergenerationally. And Indigenous people, we've been doing a lot of work in social work for the past like 20, 30 years now. Intergenerational trauma is a term that we use a lot, where it's simply not even my issues that I'm carrying. It's my mother's issues, my father's issues, my grandparents' issues. I've never been to residential school. But why is it when I see the documentary on residential school, it's hitting me on that level? You know what I mean? Like it's speaking to me, and I'm being triggered to elicit that emotional response. That's intergenerational trauma, and some people are taking it forward to even like cellular memory, where those memories are passed on. And that's sort of like a cultural philosophical belief that we have in our cosmology. Um, so yeah, like decolonization, it gets to this for me. Like this is the conversation where decolonization has to happen, is around literally how am I parenting my daughter? Literally how are we living and functioning in relation to the settlers that are occupying our traditional territory? How do we feel about that? How are we going to go about disrupting that? Do we have the strength to disrupt that? So again, like this internal dialogue, even how do I respond, right? How do I respond to another person's emotions is a very decolonial thing for me.
And I think another narrative that maybe both of our cultures buys into is warrior culture or honor culture. So I can't speak for you. So I'll speak for myself, and then you tell me how much of it overlaps, and then you could speak about your own experience. But for Asian Americans, there's very little that Western culture might honor. They might fetishize a bunch of stuff, but like one of the things that they highlight and then just kind of reduce everything away other than this is warrior culture, right? This martial arts culture of Asia. And Japan would be a great example of the samurai warrior culture, which most of it is Western propaganda made up. Bushido is made up. But they do this. And so then an Asian person might take the interpretation of Asia from Western white society and then adopt that as like, that must be the capital T truth. That is our culture. And then buy into this type of like masculinity. There's all this baggage of not being able to deal with my emotions, this type of lowercase stoicism of like being emotionless, not doing the process or the emotional work, right? And then that can hold us back in all these psychological ways that you're talking about. And I know a lot of reactionaries and even some like macho leftists who only want to honor and speak about the warrior culture within indigenous people or the honor culture, right? Where it's like, oh, you offended my honor, now I have to kill you. Or that 90% of that culture is like the movie 300. It is this movie version of Sparta that is like the indigenous culture. I mean, just from an observer standpoint, that is what I've seen. And I wonder then, much like Asian Americans, how they can buy into those narratives. I wonder if indigenous, especially indigenous men, buy into those kind of Western propaganda about themselves. And then that can hold them back in doing the trauma work, or even like in things they do, like in relationships or in parenting and so forth.
Yeah, totally. There is this like romanticization, like I jokingly say it's Orientalism, but the other way.
Yeah.
With like indigenous culture, indigenous warriors culture. Not to say we didn't have that, because we did, and you know, a lot of it does still exist internally within our community systems and our cultural practices. But yeah, there is this romanticization of like the warrior ethic, and you know, being like a completely emotionally rigid person and all this stuff. And again, like toxic masculinity exists even in our society, and a lot of people are really trying to deconstruct that and get into like compassion and love, because that also exists in our society. Like more importantly, our people were a compassionate people. Like we always hear, even in our language, how our language is a compassionate language. It was more tied to the practice of kinship and even peace and diplomacy and getting along, because when we lived on the landscape, we literally had to come together as a people to survive the landscape, because it's a very harsh environment, in particular where I live, on the prairie. Like we get plus 40 in the summer and minus 40 in the winter. So communal systems are really important. And of course, there was warrior cultures involved in that. But when you're looking at like the relationship we have with Western expansion, they were encountering the warrior, right? So they're encountering the person that was supposed to protect women and children. And like, there's a lot of warrior philosophy I heard growing up. There was a lot of traditional warrior philosophy I heard growing up, because I predominantly had uncles in my family who knew and had access to some of those stories. But one key thing is that the West was viewing how we went about trying to protect who we are. So we got labeled very quickly as, you know, the savage, or I know identifying. It's really interesting, because there's either like, I always encounter white people who either have the racist stereotypes of who we are as warriors, or view us as like the romantic warrior.
Well, I see racist right-wing people online use a lot of indigenous iconography where they might post a picture of a scary wolf with some stupid quote or a scary lion with some stupid quote. And then they will dehumanize an indigenous person and treat them like one of those animals and actually sometimes use the same quotes that were used underneath like one of those animal pictures. They'll put an indigenous warrior that is totally like cartoonish caricature and then put that same quote there. In their mind, they think they're like flexing or romanticizing the indigenous person, but really they're just dehumanizing them.
Exactly. And yeah, like you just didn't, I don't know what it is. Like when we were launching my podcast and we were getting ready to launch it, we were like researching and looking at different podcasts and listening to things. And of course, we obviously, found one of the biggest podcasts online. And I'm not even going to say its name because people will know who it is. And it's, and this dude literally was reading books about Native Americans and podcasting, books about Native Americans, about Comanches, who my partner, my daughter is part Comanche and my partner's Comanche, and literally giving plugs to this book and getting the author on there and talking about all this, either like really romantic stuff around, they were amazing people, amazing warriors, but they're also savages. They're also savages and they were killing and raping people and very brutal. And there was like no middle ground there. And then all of a sudden, these books were flying off the shelves because he was reading these books and plugging them on his podcast. And now there's like a bunch of right-wing people who are posting like Wild West iconography. And
yeah, I saw that on Instagram.
Yeah, and like going back to like, oh, this was like the heyday of, I wish we could live back in this time. But for me as an Indigenous person viewing that, it's like, no, that was not a good time for our people. Like literally what you're saying is you're wishing you could go back to the time when, colonial violence was very physical and you could get away with doing those physical acts of violence. And it's so weird how we exist like either as a very romanticized people in the eyes of, settlers, or we exist as a very savage people in the eyes of settlers. And both of those are very colonial stereotypes and tied to, the racist interpretation of who we are. And with those podcasts and a lot of those plugs that are showing up now with the right, no one's talking to Indigenous people. Like you could literally get a Comanche on that podcast to talk about it and unpack that. But no, they went with like some weird author who just like dedicated some time to writing highly fictional book about, Comanche people. And my partner and her family and people who are Comanche and descendants of those people and still are those people don't like that book. Like they literally don't like that book because he never talked to anybody. He didn't ask anybody. And literally there's oral histories as to why some of those things took place, why some of those historical circumstances took place. And there's oral histories tied to that because they happened only like 2-3 generations ago. And again, they're viewed in very weird, posted like they're framed very weird and in a very limiting way where the narratives are maintained in very problematic ways, and they do more damage than good. Because what would happen if I go to the people who listen to that podcast and say, okay, great, well, let's do some land back stuff? No, they're gonna run me out of the building. They're gonna want to enact that colonial violence because you know what I mean. It's tied to those very problematic beliefs that a lot of them hold.
Well, Comanche itself, I think the urban slang for that term now, and has been for a while, it just means warrior, right? It's used interchangeably more than any other indigenous tribe, right? Like Comanche helicopters to sometimes like you'll see a fighter who's not even indigenous, but their nickname might be Comanche. Or like instead of saying warrior or soldier or even like somebody violent, they might just say Comanche. They came at me like a Comanche, right? It's become this slang. Warrior itself is more of a neutral term. It could be used a lot of ways. I would say Comanche is a type of warrior that is a negative context of that term.
Yeah, and my daughter, that's her family. So I have kinship ties to the Comanche now, and they call themselves Namana. So even like the term Comanche isn't even the real term of what they call themselves, right? So even that is just like highlights, how crazy this whole Western interpretation of who we are gets. Is they're reinforcing the English terminology that they had to invent to explain to people they weren't even willing to talk with.
I mean, Koreans don't call themselves Korean.
Yeah, makes sense.
We can't even say the R, right? Korea, we can't even say that R.
That's true. Yeah.
We would have to say Korean, to your point, right? Those aren't even our words. We adopted their words for ourselves.
Yeah. And interesting for this podcast, like Plains Cree Nakota, those aren't also our traditional words of what we call yourself, like Neheopoatak, right? That's, if I said that to my people, they know, oh, he's Plains Cree Nakota. But again, like just the irony of doing a podcast in a colonial tongue, it's all we got right now.
Yeah, I assume so, because that's why I was asking about planes. I was like, that's an English term, right? I don't think they would put that at the preface of who they were. So the rest of it is probably also something that had to be changed. It had to use a settler tongue.
Yeah, and then a lot of this just ties into like Edward Said's Orientalism stuff, right? Is how they're inventing this terminology to explain who we are, and uplifting those fake narratives, and and it's really weird. Like even like I don't want to speak for the Comanches because there's a lot of amazing people doing amazing work to maintain their culture and their language, and I'm doing the best I can to support my partner and my daughter to learn their language and things like that too. But yeah, they're really popular with the Western narrative because they were actively engaging in physical resistance. There's no denying that they chose to physically resist the colonial expansion project, and they were successful for generations in maintaining their traditional land and territory. But it wasn't until like industrialization where, settlers ultimately had access to certain things that caused their projects to shift and change. But interestingly enough, I don't know if you know, but the Comanche helicopter, I think that's a failed project.
Yeah.
So they couldn't even actually, get that project off the ground, but had the audacity to name it after Indigenous people.
I had a previous episode talking about this, but I think for leftists who are anti-war, they're aware that most of the money spent on the military budget goes to stuff like that fails, right? Stuff that is just a waste of money, but they make it sound epic and then use a very insulting name to try to make it more epic. And then it doesn't even work. It's a failure. And most of that stuff, they don't care if it's a failure because that money is still going to private companies to make it. They could just make giant boxes. They don't care what they're making as long as they're making something, whether you use it or not. These companies don't care as long as you keep giving them money.
Yeah, it totally makes sense.
So something else you talk about is lateral violence. Could you explain what that is and explain what that means within the context of the Indigenous community?
Yeah, so in the context of like my community, how we're utilizing that right now, generally on the surface level, is how we negatively act out towards each other in our own community. And I think like generally people just have the assumption that that's what it means, that it's sort of like how you act out negatively towards somebody who you have kinship to or is on the same project as you. And it's so weird because I sat in on Western capitalist workshops where they're talking about lateral violence in the workplace, and it's like constructed as like, don't act out negatively towards each other, don't gossip about each other or bully each other because it's disrupting the workplace. And that translated into like a lot of workshops and information delivery sessions to Indigenous people where they're saying, don't gossip about each other, don't, fight each other, don't disrupt each other. And at the end of the day, that's what lateral violence is. Just don't do it. And those workshops are really weak, like obviously, right? And you hear people say, well, I feel like I'm being, attacked and it's a form of lateral violence. And people still have that very general surface understanding of what lateral violence is. But for me, with my workshops and my modules, the way I present them is literally lateral violence occurs because there is a horizontal oppression taking place. So that's causing people to act out in negative ways. So the source for our oppression is colonization. So we were colonized people who were people who were impacted through colonization that literally are now in situations where we're trying to survive and increase our survivability. And, people are doing that in ways that are violent towards each other. So like gangs, for example, is a form of lateral violence. So in the mental health field, people highlight that and look into that as, there's not enough community programming, there's no youth program. So obviously youth are getting caught up in this culture and this lifestyle because they're being recruited. So we have to come up with some community programs and youth programs to get these youth before they get into those programs. But ultimately, the fact for Indigenous people is it's really hard to get any kind of programming that is liberatory like that because of colonization. So lateral violence, the way I speak to it, doesn't necessarily shame or pinpoint the act of violence itself. It pinpoints the top-down structure that's oppressing our people, which is colonization, which is colonialism, which is the literal oppression of our communities and our people. And we don't have the autonomy, we don't have the rigidity or the backbone to push back against that, because it's literally like we're being smooshed down by like a marshmallow. And I was presenting a workshop in northern Manitoba to some young people, and this little kid, like in grade 1 or 2, when I wasn't explaining lateral violence the way I'm talking about it, but I was sort of just talking about like a system that causes, you know, a lot of turmoil in our household and things like that. And he shot his hand up, and I always tell this story because this little kid always stood out to me. He shot his hand up and he had a question. I said, "Hey, you got a question?" And he's like, "Yeah." He's like, "It's like a marshmallow." And I was like, "It's like a marshmallow? Like, what are you talking about?" And he's all like, "Well, did you ever take a marshmallow and did you ever smoosh it?" And that's how he explained it. It was like squishing a marshmallow with 2 of your hands. And I said, "Yeah." And he's like, "What you're talking about is like a marshmallow." And it makes perfect sense, because our communities, our nations, our family systems aren't as strong in terms of having a backbone to resist colonialism, because structurally it's not there for us because of colonization. And our communities are acting out laterally violent, where now we're taking it out against each other.
It creates a pressure cooker.
Yeah, it does. And people freak out. There's, bursts of violence towards each other. And this falls in the hands of colonialism, because now the settlers saying, "Oh, you guys are savages. Oh, you are a bunch of gang members. Oh, you are a bunch of thieves." And, when we get into like decolonization, we first have to psychologically become situationally aware that, the problem isn't lateral violence right now. It's the structure of colonization that's causing those events that we have to address. So it completely shifts it away from that little surface level of, don't disrupt productivity in the workplace lateral violence, to a big systemic decolonial project where it's like, no, look, we're underfunded. We're not allowed to do this. We're not allowed to do that. The Indian Act's still in play. Capitalism's in play, where it's oppressing our people, and we don't have access to the resources we need access to thrive. So we're dedicating all our time to finding a job that's not fulfilling us. And we have to work on that. We have to deconstruct that, or we have to find a way to push back against that in order for lateral violence to stop. So again, that whole mental health approach of lateral violence is tied to understanding decolonization. It's tied to understanding and creating a decolonial project.
In a previous conversation, we were talking about self-defense and martial arts from a political standpoint and from an indigenous community standpoint, and how you can't train it the way it's taught, right, by settler society, because the context is different, right? You talked about how somebody you're teaching something to doesn't want to like maim or kill their uncle or somebody that they have some kind of kinship with. So then even in self-defense ways, thinking about lateral violence and what causes this lateral violence, martial arts is very libertarian, survivalist, kill anyone who messes with me. That's the approach to martial arts self-defense. And that is very hostile and inappropriate then in this type of context and in this type of community.
Yeah, like if from an indigenous standpoint, for me as an indigenous person, I view the Western world as violent. Like they always resort to violence, and you hear this in the MMA community, like the far right MMA community in particular now is really just like expressing naturally what they've always expressed for me as an indigenous person. Even in like the explanation of self-defense, like even in self-defense combative jiu-jitsu, they frame things as the bad guy, right? So inherently, if you're framing things as the bad guy, that means the person who's learning these skills is the good guy. But, me being in jiu-jitsu gyms and rolling, I know there's not good guys in there. So just even that terminology isn't really speaking to who we are and how my people are and how I need to learn things. And yeah, like rolling with like young indigenous kids, the question did come up is like, well, what if uncle had too much to drink, and he shows up drunk and I don't want to break his arms. Right. So we're approaching self-defense in a very different way. And for whatever reason, when settlers get going, they're very physically violent. Like they're actively like carrying forward intimidation. They're actively carrying forward control and dominance and aggression. Whereas, for us and for me in particular, it's not necessarily like wanting to control or wanting to dominate a situation. It's more so wanting to navigate that for the best possible outcome, which honestly speaks more to our warrior culture and paradigm than it does of sheer dominance and violence. So yeah, like definitely, like when we're looking at lateral violence, yeah, if you're not conscious of it, it does look very aggressive. It does look very toxic. But then when you come at it from being systematically aware, if you replace those skills and give people that awareness to be situationally aware, then we could begin to disrupt that whole lateral violence. We could begin to replace it with skill sets and resources that are going to sort of give people the power to realize, okay, this isn't the best way to go about things. And I got to keep in mind that there's an ongoing colonization project that I have to position always in what I'm doing.
You've probably seen me try to nudge and try to like gently bring up this topic within leftist, anti-fascist, or even like baby leftists. Maybe they're just like liberal who are curious about the left, but they're in the world of combat sports, martial arts, or interested in anti-fascism. A lot of them have like these very violent ideations, right? These thoughts all the time. Whether somebody messes with me, comes to my dojo and disrespects me, or it's a Nazi, to me, there's no difference. I want to violently do something to this person, right? And trying to address that. Where is this coming from? Where is this trauma coming from, right? Why is that your first go-to, right? Not necessarily like that physically having to defend yourself is wrong, but why do you fantasize about it? Where is this coming from, right? And trying to address that even on the left, even among anti-fascists. And I think sometimes that's what attracts people to anti-fascism. It's like, oh, then I am morally justified in living out these violent ideations that I have constantly every hour, right? And so that's the type of like psychological work that I'm just trying to address now with a lot of these just men. It's mostly men with these types of ideas and trying to just like getting them to do some internal work and think about it, And right now, because I'm at the beginning of having these conversations with people I know, the response is mixed, right? Not everybody's ready to have these conversations. But to your point, right? Why is it their want, especially when it comes to like combat sports or self-defense, to just like go to 100? Like, even submission grappling, like we have all this skill. What about de-escalation grappling? What about like this care-informed idea of martial arts and self-defense,
Yeah. For sure. So like the way I could speak to that is like when we're doing organization or organizing in blockades here in this area, there's always like the settler who's new to it. So there's always like it's always predominantly a white guy who's new to it and is like showing up and be like, yeah, I'm ready to get arrested. Yeah, I'm willing to go all out. And, I'm going to be at the front line and yeah, let's do this. I'm a warrior type stuff. But Indigenous people, in particular in my community, we actively organize in ways where we're ensuring people's safety. So, we had some clashes with people where they're all like, oh, I don't know if I want to dedicate time to this because it's not structured enough. It's not organized enough. But for us up here, especially when you're looking at Canada with like I Don't Know More that took place historically, and maybe we could give some links to what that is and how it took place in Canada. But pop-up activism or pop-up actions were the safest way for Indigenous people to do things. So like, saying, let's meet here at this time, let's do the flash mob thing and let's all get there so everyone's safe and let's all leave at the same time. That was like the way we ensure safety. And it still is the way that, a lot of local organizing takes place. So like settlers who were coming to those conversations were like, well, who do I talk to? How do we structure this? Who's going to organize that? Who's going to organize this? And then them wanting to be 100% all out in terms of the conflict just doesn't make sense to us and doesn't make sense to me. And it's really hard for them to digest that because it's either 0 to 100. But no, the goal is to ensure safety. And that applies to self-defense. How am I going to protect myself in the safest way possible? So offensive and defensive strategies are really important. And even just situating things like that is really important. We're not thinking so much about the offensive right now. We're thinking about the defensive. How do we keep our people safe in this system? So for self-defense, like for me, it's literally all about defense, right? It's all about defense because for me as like the 240-pound Indigenous male, if I go offensive, I'm going to be arrested. Like I'm the one that's going to get pinned to the ground and get beat up by the cops. So being very mindful of that is really important. And it's hard for people who haven't been in those spaces of being oppressed or being labeled or being in the tension around activism to understand that it's very delicate. It's very, I mean, for lack of a better word, it's very tactical. Like we have to very think strategically and even surgically in some cases of how these projects look for us, because we've got to ensure safety. And and again, like it is predominantly people who are new. Like I notice it's people who are new to the space where it's like it becomes really performative, where it's like they wear the matching outfit and they have their activist outfit, and it's like, settle down. We have like kids here who are in a onesie, and single moms here who need to go back home to make dinner at this action. We're not going to like elicit any type of violence. So like just in context to that, we have to be mindful. Like we have to be really mindful of strategy and leverage, which is a jiu-jitsu thing, right? And like percentage, like how far, what's our scale right now? Like, are we going 20, 30%, 40% type thing? All that stuff is very real, and like how I understand self-defense and how I've been taught self-defense, and how I've reappropriated to fit my own needs.
Again, going back to Fanon, stretching it, right, to meet the right context. And even that section of his book that concerns on violence, it's like you're concerned about violence, whereas these people show up and they're excited about violence, right? It's like two different intentions, two different concerns. One is looking for it, and the other one is trying to keep everybody safe. And this is something that's historically even been a problem in revolutionary movements in the US, especially with the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. It reminds me of this quote by Fred Hampton when he was talking about them is,
it's anarchistic, opportunistic, individualistic, it's chauvinistic, it's custoristic, and that's the bad part about it. It's custoristic in that its leaders take people into situations where the people can be massacred, and they call that revolution. And it's nothing but child's play, it's folly. We think these people may be sincere, but they're misguided, they're muddleheads, and they're scatterbrains.
And he talks about that they're adventurous, they're opportunists, right? So activism then becomes a form of adventure. On this adventurous ride that they take other people on, they might get those other people killed.
Yeah, like the best way I could describe it, and not to discount my colleagues and people who I would be really happy to stand side by side with in places of tension, but there are some people who literally try on activism or try on mobilizing or try on decolonization as if it's a jacket they're wearing, like as if they're just seeing how it looks and feels. And with this jacket comes like the image of, looking like somebody who's doing the work. But then, a few weeks pass down the line, a few years pass down the line, and suddenly, their salary kicks in, or, home life kicks in, and suddenly they hang the jacket up and we don't hear from them again. Whereas for Indigenous people, it's a lifelong thing. Like people are embedded in these projects for forever, and they're intergenerational. And, not to discount people who want change and keeping themselves safe, but I do notice that security culture in particular amongst settlers, it's important, especially for trans people and people who are susceptible to police violence and very real physical violence. Security culture is important. But in our experience, we observe that people who tend to cover their faces are people who try on that jacket and want to put it up later on down the line. And that's kind of, cool. There's a body there. Like there's somebody there who's holding space with us. But then at the same time, it's also like they're going to turn the corner in a few years and run for Prime Minister of Canada, which is still a settler colonial project. Or they're going to run for in the local election type thing and do the change the system from within thing, which, doesn't really align with my politics and my political goals that I have in mind, or that doesn't really align with how we're going to decolonize. Because again, that's tied to the settler colonial apparatus and the settler political culture.
Yeah.
Also, the real concern too is that, like some people view violence as offensive. And again, we have to be really critical of that, because just look at colonial history, right? We know, like Indigenous people know full well the type of violence that the Western expansion project historically played, and also that the settler state could still play. Like, that's very real for us. And that's why we do have conversations around violence and what's acceptable, what's not, offensive and defensive strategies and things like that, because, some people show up and they go all out and it's just not safe. And being very critical and mindful of those people too.
So speaking about this psychological standpoint and the types of activists that show up, you mentioned how Fanonian psychology helps to deconstruct some of the baggage of white leftists who come into indigenous spaces to initiate actions or discourse. For example, you mentioned parental issue or trauma response versus social or political response. So can you explain these concepts for us? Because this actually describes a lot of people, but they might not realize it due to approaching all of this politically and not doing any of the internal work that should come with left politics.
Yeah. So obviously for me, for me, decolonization is structural. Like, we have to create the structure and we have to create, governance systems. We have to recreate or reinvigorate them for Indigenous people. And, some are still out there. Some just need reinvigoration. And for some people, they have to actually go about the whole recreation project or reclaiming of what they once had. So for me, it's actual tangible stuff. So for me, it's the physical implementation and creation of stuff that we need, like the literal infrastructural projects. And I always refer to them as infrastructure. But when you're looking at certain people of the left show up and have conversations, it's almost like it's reactionary simply to the current state of affairs. And again, just speaking at it, coming at it from an Indigenous person, where we always witness the ebb and flow of mainstream politics. And we've been observing them for hundreds of years, obviously, since we've had contact. There's people who are just simply coming at the political conversations of wanting to critique the current or wanting to speak out against the toxic family system they have experienced. And that's not necessarily wrong, but that is an emotional trauma response where, they had racist uncles and aunties, they had racist grandparents. So they want to sort of side with the opposite and to disrupt that dynamic. But again, that is a very real, surface level. Well, for me, it's a surface level response that I observe. And they do have to dive into what is the core outcome of what they're trying to accomplish. Because for us, for me, for Indigenous people or oppressed people who are actually living it, a lot of this stuff is structural. A lot of this stuff is physical disruption.
Because with your parents, right, then what happens when you reconcile with your parents? Does the activism disappear? And yeah, it does. Sometimes it does. Or you just get away from your parents. And then what? Then you're done. Whereas when it's structural like this, you can't ever get away from it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Adding on to this, you also do workshops on life skills. From a white suburban perspective, this is usually code for a motivation coach who promises to get you rich. But from the Indigenous context, it's much more practical and relates to surviving and managing the context of settler society. So can you speak to us about some of the things you teach, especially to young Indigenous people?
Yeah, for sure. So life skills modules and life skills, I guess the approach of life skills comes out of a certain aspect of wanting to give people some sort of skill set to be able to get a job, right? That's the surface level stuff. And, you hear in the US and a lot of wellness culture, life coach stuff, which is a weekend certificate. And all of a sudden you could put it on your Instagram profile and, do contracts or whatever and take on clients. But for us, my parents in particular, they've been training life skills coaches in a very well-developed intensive program where it's 5 phases they have to take over the course of a few months and create curriculum and content that is actually helping people navigate emotional trauma, where it's literally giving people the skill set to help themselves, to be able to help people process emotions and to ultimately be able to facilitate programs and communities. We created a life skills program ultimately that does sort of meet the needs of Indigenous people in a culturally informed way, in a way that is trauma informed. And again, building self-esteem and things like that, interpersonal skills, communication, being mindful of relationships, being mindful of family systems. And we train people to go out and do that work, which is very contrary to how a lot of people approach life coaching or life skills coaching, whereas it's a career move where they want to become a life skills coach to make money off of and contract out. Whereas we're actually saying, no, instead of hiring me every year to go to your community, why don't you send 2 people to get the certification training and they'll go back and deliver those programs for you in a culturally informed way that understands the community they're living in. So for me, I was trained like when I was 18 years old by my father to be a life skills coach and run these programs and life skills programs and things like that. And for the most part, we do look at colonialism. We do look at, cultural aspects. But in recent years, like in the past 10 years, I really developed a more decolonial approach where I was promoting an understanding of colonialism. And again, introducing participants to decolonization. And that's basically how I position a lot of these community programs and workshops that I'm hired to run for some people. And then it's been really successful. Like they were successful to the point of where some people won't hire me now because they were too successful. Like I had a young group that I was running in an Indigenous community, and we talked about colonialism and neocolonialism and decolonization, and they started to ask questions about oil and gas extraction. And a lot of people didn't like them asking those questions, and they sort of looked into where did they learn this stuff from, and they kind of traced it back to my summer program I was running in the community. And yeah, they didn't want me back. But that's a success. That was a success in my eyes. So I measure success differently than most people would, I think.
And to define some terms, we've been talking about the differences between settler colonialism versus traditional colonialism. And a type of colonialism you brought up a couple of times was neocolonialism. And I've brought it up as well when it comes to Korea. So the example you just gave actually is oil and gas extraction. Settler colonialism is about replacing, and colonization overall is a broader term that can talk about these policies that enact things like settler colonialism or exploitation colonialism or things like that, or even neocolonialism. And so what is neocolonialism? That is the part where it's not about replacing the people, but going in and extracting money from their resources like oil and gas. So that would be an example of how multiple different types of colonialism happens on the same people, on the same piece of land, where not only are you replacing the people, having them live under your settler society, reframing their society, oppression and all that, but also extracting resources from their land, from their community, like oil and gas, and then not only doing it without their permission, but also not sharing any of that profit with those people. So colonialism is ultimately also about exploitation.
Yeah, it totally is. Like the best way I describe that is, I mean, a lot of your listeners might be familiar with the oil and gas, the tar sands in Alberta. So there's been a lot of mobilization in Alberta and Saskatchewan against oil and gas extraction industry, just simply because it's so close to a lot of traditional territories. And it is ultimately on an Indigenous traditional territory. But the best way I could describe the neocolonial dynamic is, under historical colonialism is like, we're going to take your resources and too bad. Whereas under neocolonialism, it's like the biggest trick now, the biggest, amazing trick they pulled is like, okay, instead of us extracting those resources, we're still going to extract them under the model of this corporation and the industry. But why don't we hire your people to do the extraction for us? Why don't we hire your people to work in that industry? And that's what's happening. Like we see that, and that even exists like in the military industrial complex, right? Where now it's like they're colonizing oppressed people to serve the empire. And that exists in terms of industry here too. It's like, well, we're going to hire your people. So yeah, give us the rights to go into this territory, or at least sit with us and give us permission. And then we'll hire your people to, work the jobs. And now you got, 50 jobs for your people in your community. But it's coming at a cost, right? So the biggest trick now that's sort of played out is instead of taking the land and territory just for themselves, they tricked us into actually working the land for them. And I mean, under capitalism, it's not like slavery per se, but they pay us just enough. They pay people just enough. And I have friends who I talk to about who are in the oil and gas sector, and we had completely different career paths. But I mean, I could have just been I was as close to becoming a laborer as anyone in the oil and gas sector. And they agree, where they're saying, my back's broken, and it's not a comfortable job, but I'm locked in because of debt now. I'm locked in because I have a family, but I could definitely see how this is impacting our land and our way of life. And I had friends who walked away from the oil and gas sector who's just said, this doesn't sit right with me. And that's neocolonialism. Like it's getting us locked into capital and capitalism in ways where it's not beneficial to our lands, our people, and ultimately even our bodies. And some of those jobs are like, I mean, they're not the best jobs. Like some people are working the on the bottom tier of the job where they're, you know, cleaning toilets and cooking food. And yeah, it's not positive in any way.
Yeah, extraction of profit from the land, extraction of oil and gas always comes with extraction of labor. So in neocolonialism, they always attach the labor part because you're always going to also have extraction of labor when you're also extracting natural resources. That's neocolonialism, I guess, in that way. Then for people, just to define some terms again, then you can think about neoliberalism as a version of that. But instead of being about a colonial project, it's more of a general project that affects all of us, where we're all being extracted and it's all being privatized and we're all being exploited in this way. So sometimes people don't know what neoliberalism is. And I think neoliberalism, that definition is tied to the definition of neocolonialism. Neo in those senses are used in the same way, this new type of exploitation where it isn't historical traditional violence, though there is violence, of course, with the police, but it's much more buttoned up and sophisticated now.
A note to our loyal listeners: if you love the show, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by joining Team Southpaw on Patreon. By becoming a member, you'll get access to bonus content like exclusive articles, fight previews, bonus episodes, transcripts of fight studies, and access to our private chat group on Discord. But more importantly, you will help us supplement the cost of the show, the incredible time and energy Sam and I put into making the show, and you'll be giving us some breathing room not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also expand Southpaw into other areas. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
So like with neocolonialism, when I explain that to a lot of people, sometimes they have a hard time because, you know, they got a job. What do you mean I got a job? You know, I can save enough money to take my kids to Disneyland, and that's great for me. But then you sort of have to have some sort of inquiry where you could deconstruct and highlight how neocolonialism and neoliberalism are very systematically problematic. And so it's kind of trickery in that way where, you know, you explain colonization and people are like, oh yeah, the Wild West, it was problematic. Cool, they killed us. I get it. But then you get into neoliberalism, it's like, no, you know, you're paid just enough to be kept busy where this bigger project's taking place.
Well, the psychological standpoint then also comes in where it's like, how is having a job and taking your kids to Disneyland, how is that your dream? How is that the goalpost, right? Then it takes some internal work to figure out, wait, why did I set that as the goalpost? Because if they set your goalpost for you and then they meet those needs, then of course you think you're fine, but you didn't get to set your goal. They set it for you and convinced you that's what you wanted, right? So there's the psychological aspect of neocolonialism and neoliberalism that you can't just approach from an economic standpoint. This is where Fanon comes in again.
Yeah, and then also like if you're getting young men or young women in particular to get into those industries very early, they're educated by the labor force of those industries, which is inherently biased.
Yes.
Which I also witnessed and observed. And again, that does play out into other big settler colonial projects or imperial projects, like even around the military, where people start to regurgitate, you know, what they're being told by people who are in the same workplace as them. And it's problematic because now you have like, it's so weird to meet somebody who has so much self-hate for their own people. And they sound like a white conservative, but they're not physically a white conservative. And again, that's sort of how neocolonialism is basically just like carrying forward this project and yielding results that ultimately fall into their favor, that we have to be more systemically aware of and view things as systems and view things just beneath the surface and dive into deeper conversations and analysis.
Well, you have to crap on yourself to be accepted into white society because they like hearing that stuff, right? Like for me as a Korean person, they love hearing me crap on North Korea, right? The DPRK. And the more I do that, the more they're like, oh, yeah. They like hearing that stuff. Their eyes light up when I have stories about how bad North Korea is, right? So in doing that, then it's like gaining social capital. I'm gaining more proximity to white society. I am getting closer to being white. I am living the dream. I'm getting closer to my goal that they set for me.
Yeah, and that's Fanon black skin white mask stuff, right? Where you're starting to imitate the colonizer, and a lot of people are doing it subconsciously. They just think that's the way the world is.
Perfect, because then that follows up to my next question about double consciousness, which is something Fanon speaks about, which actually goes back to W.E.B. Du Bois. So can you explain the concept for us and how it can be stretched, as Fanon would put it, to explain the indigenous experience?
Yeah, like a lot of people use double consciousness in general. Like I find they're referring to it more so just in terms of like the surface level of being able to navigate two worlds. So you hear a lot of like indigenous people, young people say they're navigating two worlds, which works for their analysis, and it works to obviously, you know, go to university and things like that. I know in like indigenous sciences now there's a term they use where they call it two-eyed seeing, where you could use Western science and traditional ecology and understanding to sort of get a better view of the world. And obviously, like I do that when I look at climate change research and data and stuff like that, where I look at oral histories and climate change data, and you can kind of see how they line up, or traditional cosmology and things like that, and how they're lining up with climate change data. But yeah, double consciousness is a tool. Like it's definitely a tool and tool belt that allows people to navigate. And it does two things. It's almost like a double-edged sword though, because one thing that tends to happen is like in the stage we're at within a colonial relationship with the settler state, there's also like the emergence of like the comprador bourgeois. There's an elite, there's a higher class that's emerging now with education and with, you know, getting jobs with the settler state that ultimately may not necessarily yield the best outcomes for decolonization. So sometimes people use the two world concept to justify certain principles, like obviously capitalism. Like people use double consciousness to say, oh, we're walking in two worlds, so I have to work my 9 to 5 from Monday to Friday and uplift the settler colonial project, but then I'm going to come home on Saturday and Sunday and be indigenous on Saturday and Sunday, or come home in the summertime thing. And it's really unsettling conversations for people to have when we actually begin to deconstruct that. But at the same time, like being a chameleon is a very real tactic used by indigenous people, where you have to go through the motions sometimes. Like for me, getting into jujitsu, I didn't show up to talk politics with people. I showed up to get in and get out. And I was going through the motions of learning and drilling. You know what I mean? That was a chameleon mode for me, just going in and coming out. And we do that consciously. Like that's a conscious effort that people are aware of. And it's a tool. Like it's definitely a tool where you have to choose your battles and pick your battles. And I think double consciousness speaks in that way to me. But again, just speaking in context to it also being a double-edged sword. And it's being misused, I find, a lot in recent years to justify certain problematic paradigms that are clearly like extraction-based or tied to certain industries.
I think when W.E.B. Du Bois first brought it up, it was a critique of white supremacy. And I think how Fanon used it was that definition plus a critique of colonialist society. So double consciousness is this umbrella for ideas like code switching, which is even like kind of a popular, cool term. People like think it's good to do that. And also the white gaze. Double consciousness is like being aware about how white people might look at you and also then adopting that gaze, right? So double consciousness is like the umbrella for smaller ideas or superficial ideas like that. But to your point, it's become sort of a life skill. But the tyranny is it's a life skill because white society won't adapt to you. So you have to adapt to it, which again is colonialism. The whole reason why you need double consciousness is because we live in a colonialist society, right? In a society that is founded on white supremacy.
Yeah, and I like how you said that, because for me personally, at this point in my where I'm at, you know, in terms of my own psychology and my own embodiment of who I am, I don't really subscribe to the two world theory. Like personally, I say that because for me, I definitely acknowledge that. For one, I want to have a decolonial world. Like I want to live in that space. And secondly, I don't want to compromise myself. Like, sure, I'm going to pick my battles, but morally and psychologically and philosophically, I'm going to be who I am. And I don't want to compromise that. And I don't want to have to justify compromising that. I don't want to have to sit at a table where I'm compromising that. And for me, like even with my career path, I'm really conscious of who I work with, because I've been lucky enough to say I don't have a white boss that's dictating to me what to do. And there's a privilege in that, yes, but it's also a conscious choice of where I'm choosing to not subscribe to the need to live in two worlds.
I think the way Fanon was using it, to your point, is not as a skill, not as something cool to do, but as a psychological struggle, a psychological dilemma where you have double consciousness, but eventually you want to just have one consciousness, one world, because having double consciousness, like constant code switching, thinking of it as a skill actually only reinforces psychological trauma and pain. When you come together, when you decolonize and just live in one world, and it's just like have one tongue that you speak under. This is how you say my name. This is who I am, is the only way then you can really start to heal.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think even just the context of, when you're looking at like civil rights for the era where double consciousness started to become sort of like a creation, like a concept, was sort of in an era where, you did have to really physically navigate as a Black person, from my observation of history, have to navigate those spaces, in particular in the US, right?
Yeah. It's like you have to be aware of it. You might have to do it a little bit or maybe a lot just to survive, to make it through the day. But your moral compass should not be pointing towards that, but pointing to just one consciousness, and maybe, to your perspective, pointing to a post-colonial society.
Yeah, and again, it's a tool in a tool belt, right? So you don't necessarily carry it with you always, but it's there if you need it. And so, like, teaching it as a life skills in that way, where you're basically putting resources in people's tool belts to utilize in situations. And again, double consciousness is a tool belt that you could draw on. And again, this is my understanding as an Indigenous male. Like, I know there's different, in particular, African American and Black relationships to that philosophical concept and stuff. But this is how I've been interpreting it and utilize it in my own discourse.
Yeah. And I think our overarching thesis, right, is how all these ideas can be stretched to benefit us in navigating this world, right? And talking about that and navigating the world, I know you've traveled the world participating in land-based education. So can you tell us what land-based education is? Because you've already talked about land back.
So yeah, that whole concept of land-based education is basically, has become popularized amongst Indigenous educators in Canada right now. There's a big sort of like pedagogical shift in pedagogy to get Indigenous students out of the classroom and onto the land base, because so much of our culture and our philosophy and our language and our practices are tied to the landscape. So actually getting children out there to engage in those practices as a way to revitalize culture, revitalize identity and language. And a lot of people are shifting to that. A lot of people are doing that now. Land-based education is basically educators stepping out of the classroom and getting children to be out on the landscape in a very healthy, meaningful way, and shifting towards that sort of approach. And again, like, if you just think about it, like, structurally, education has always been sort of like a very double-edged sword for Indigenous people, because it is inherently colonial, because that was not the way we educate our people. So even just like the classroom approach is pretty problematic in some cases, because it is sort of like not really meeting the needs of Indigenous children, or children who have different learning styles and things like that. And again, like, I think if you just look at it like structurally, yes, land back's the goal, but also land-based education gets people to interact with the land, to be able to see the value of the land.
It's about basing a curriculum on the land and then reframing how to value the land and what a society based around the land is about.
Yeah, totally. So like, you see a lot of educators bring climate change data into the conversation, environmentalism into the conversation. And for Indigenous educators, they bring culture into that sort of pedagogy.
Okay, so it is kind of a class meant to do a paradigm shift about reframing how you think about everything.
Exactly. It totally is.
So can you tell us about your time in Mexico?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So some of your listeners might be aware that, the Zapatistas offered a program where they opened their doors to people coming in, the Zapatista Escuelita, so the Zapatista Little School. So we applied for that program. My brother and a settler ally applied to go down there and spend some time down there in Zapatista territory with them through the Zapatista Escuelita. And we did. We actually went down there, and it was pretty amazing.
So who are the Zapatistas?
For sure. So the Zapatistas is obviously an organization. They have a structural model where they're geared and set up to maintain their own autonomy, politically, economically, and even socially. So it's a very well thought out, comprehensive project. And again, I'm not necessarily an expert. I'm not necessarily like from the region. There's probably someone out there who can speak to it better than me, but that's how, for me as an Indigenous person observing their project, I view it as that. They're made up mainly of Tzotzil and Satel Mayan, so they are Indigenous people who are encompassing the majority of the people who are involved in that organization and in that model. And they're famous for like visually looking like a paramilitary. So like if people Google Zapatistas, you're going to see, Subcomandante Marcos with his mask on, and you're going to see people with guns and on horseback and things like that. And for whatever reason, that's the Western media portrayal.
That's not what you got.
No, that's not what I got at all. If anyone follows me on social media, I think I have some photos up. But that's not what we got at all. I was kind of mindful and conscious that, okay, they're welcoming us into their territory and they're Indigenous. So me and my brother obviously approached things from the perspective of, well, let's bring our cosmology to this relationship. Let's go there being respectful, and sort of just practice our own traveling practices we have. So we put a lot of attention into it to go down there and connect with these people. And they picked up on it. I mean, the people that were assigned to watch over us, I think like just in the same day, I met my guardian, the guy who was supposed to watch me. I mean, the Zapatistas have an amazing structure and model, and they also have a lot of security culture, just sort of ingrained in how they do things and organize things. So literally me and my brother, when we got there, we had to spend the night in San Cristobal de las Casas, and the next day they took us to a caracol, so one of their main governance centers. And literally we were getting off the bus, and we both kind of had a feeling that we were going to get split up. And I think they kind of told us that we're going to go to two different communities. So we knew we weren't going to be together. So we kind of just did our bro shake and gave each other hugs, and we walked off the bus, and literally like in a second we were separated. Like I was walking in one direction, he was walking in another direction, and it was all structured in that way where that was their security culture. Obviously, because Mexico was probably trying to send in, people to spy and things like that. So we got separated down there, and literally like within the day of just meeting my guardian, the guy who was assigned to obviously teach me, but he was also assigned to make sure I didn't get into any trouble or cause any trouble. We realized really quickly we were both Indigenous people. Like my Spanish is caveman Spanish, but we through the app and through my dictionary, we basically established some pretty core communication where we both realized, hey, we're on the same level and the same dynamic in terms of our understanding of colonialism and understanding our relationship to our lands and our people. And I just thought that was normal. Like I thought everyone was having that experience until we were walking around the village we were put into, and I realized that settlers weren't having that relationship with the Zapatistas they were assigned to. And a lot of them were actually pretty frustrated with some settlers or people who were coming in who weren't necessarily on that sort of level of understanding. So yeah, we spent time down there, and we had a relationship with them in that time where it wasn't that cliche Western paramilitary portrayal.
And I know you gave a talk about this and you answered this in that talk, but for us, can you explain to us why they cover their faces?
Yeah, so when I talked to my guardian about it, his name was David. I don't know if that was his real name. Again, security culture. They don't wear their masks when there's no cameras out, so he wasn't wearing his mask when we'd visit and we'd bunk together and chill and stuff. But I asked him like straight up, like, well, how come you guys wear masks? Like, where did that whole creation come from? And he said, well, it was a conscious choice to actively, obviously, protect themselves, but also philosophically, Mexico and people didn't care about their people in the mountains before. And they didn't really care to want to know who they were. So why do people want to care today? So why do people want to know who they are today? So he always said he actively knew that was the reason why they wore a mask. And if somebody who's an outsider showed up, they'll put on their masks. And if somebody with a camera wants to take a picture, they'll put on their masks. So I had to be very mindful of, asking permission for photos and letting them know I'm going to take a picture and things like that. But again, I don't think like settlers or, lefties who did apply for that program had that level of communication with some of them. And we kind of picked up on that pretty early. Something
else you just kind of mentioned, I'm going to highlight it because I think it's something we don't think about, which is you just said when you were just chilling with them, right? When we think of the Zapatistas, we just think of them, like to your point about Western betrayal, that there's such, what we think of them as exactly, but it is much more serious and grave and scary. And you think about those movies where you pan a bunch of people and they just kind of give you blank stares, these scary looks, right? And that's how they're portrayed. And you're just like, no, dude, we were just chilling. When he wasn't showing me around, we just chilled, right? Like normal people. And you like somebody, you guys chill, right? The reason why I want to point that out is important for me when we're talking about just all types of, not just indigenous people, but non-white people or people in their native lands, to try and humanize them, right? Talk about them in terms that we talk about the dominant society, right? White people can chill, right? But when you're talking about Zapatistas, we don't think about them or talk about them in that aspect. We talk about them as if like, it's Star Trek and they're the Klingons, this warrior race where like, Worf is like, we never chill. We're always serious, right? And I actually do think that is based off of it's like space cowboys and Indians, right? And it's like, no, sometimes we have to pause and be like, yeah, they just chill, hang out, they do those, they're humans, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, I don't know when the pivotal moment was. I think we were talking about like our spirituality and dances and things like that, where I showed him some pictures of our traditional dances and things I do. And he was amazed by that because he told me, and some of the people also did pick up and sort of speak to that. One of the reasons why the Zapatistas had the Escolita wasn't like, yeah, obviously they want people to know like their political organization and understand their struggle and teach the world. But they also wanted to highlight to their kids and that new emerging generation that, hey, the rest of the world doesn't have this, and the rest of the world isn't Zapatista. And a lot of people are struggling to obtain what Zapatistas obtained. And that's how David explained it to me. And I was kind of amazed with that because that sort of also gave me permission to begin to speak to him about my political struggles and my people's struggles in our land base. And we sort of met on that level of beginning to relate to colonialism from our own experience and on a very personal level speak to our relationship with our culture, our spirituality, and colonialism. And to be honest, David, I mean, the Zapatista education models, it doesn't make sense to us. Like if I was just to explain and tell you it's 3 grades or something, it's only a few grades and anybody could go at any time. It's free. A lot of grandparents go with their children to school. So a lot of grandparents who didn't get an education go with their children to stay and go to the school model. David had that education. And he was literally speaking about colonialism and capitalism and critiquing neoliberalism at the level of a grad student. And I was kind of like, dang, dude, like, what is this? Like, what are you guys doing here? And he would speak to that and sort of tell me that it's coming at it from the lived experience of seeing what was wrong and trying to remedy what was wrong. And so, he was like, I wish he could give a keynote. I wish he could give a lecture. But at the same time, there's like hundreds of Davids down there, which is just like, blows my mind.
Even though individual cultures are different, I guess under settler colonialism, there is like kind of the shared oppression, right? The shared trauma that you all get.
Yeah, there was. I mean, David, he was a few years younger than me, so he was probably born in the early 80s. I think he was around the same age as me. I was born in 86. I want to say he was probably like born in 83 because how he was speaking about when the Zapatistas mobilized under their famous mobilization in the 90s, he was still a kid and he remembers the tension. So he remembers actually like the combative aspect of their mobilization and the tension that was being experienced. And when he was speaking to that at that age and at that level, he was conscious of the effort and the transition that took place to sort of establish a better life and a better livelihood. So he had the emotional relationship to the struggle. And he didn't necessarily have the upbringing that the household I was staying in, the household we were guests in, he didn't have the upbringing of that family because David was born into the struggle. Like he was born and had enough years to sort of witness and observe it into how they mobilized. Whereas the household we were staying in, they were in their like 50s. So they were older and they were speaking to how the life was before that. So the era they grew up in was, poverty, was a lot of women were being kidnapped, no clean drinking water, They weren't allowed to chop wood. They had to ask the landowners to go and chop wood, and often they wouldn't let them. So they were really struggling, and they didn't have any housing or any projects like that. So it was like a rock bottom era for them. And what people don't realize is that the Zapatista mobilization was an active project. It didn't just happen overnight in the 90s. They were already laying the roots and organizing as far back as the 70s to begin to mobilize people. So it was almost like a 20-year project that led up to the 1990 actual land liberation they implemented. So yeah, it was really interesting to see that intergenerational or that cross-generational analysis of their livelihood. And David was of that generation that lived it and seen sort of the fruits of it. And then there was younger Zapatistas who literally grew up free, who didn't have to worry about that. And it was really emotional for me because during the day, we'd sit and watch the kids play, and they played soccer and basketball. And when I was observing this, the awareness I had, and interestingly, my brother had when he was in his village on the other side of the territory, was that these children are literally growing up free. Like there's a sense of autonomy and freedom they have, and they're playing free. Like it was amazing to see and experience. And I remember trying to talk to David about it, and we had a translator, and he was getting it. He understood it. But it was a really emotional experience for me just to see children in that state. And that was a really big driver for me to want to see my children, see my daughter experience that life ideally.
So you found some inspiration, a glimpse of what things can look like in a post-colonial society.
Yeah, like when I say that, like colonialism impacted us spiritually and mentally and emotionally, the energy was different there. Like it was completely different energy in context to them actually living and working on their land. And I felt that, like I experienced that. Like that's the only best way I could explain it, is that just the sense or the feeling that their children were free. That was an emotional feeling, and that was like a spiritual cosmological feeling for me. And even like when I think about it, I get emotional because it's really hard to put words to it. And I was aware that I haven't felt that here. Yeah, so there's a very like emotional aspect to observing them working and living on their lands. And what's interestingly, just to be like 100% blunt about it, is that their land back project did elicit a project of violence, and it did utilize Marxist theory. It is inherently left, but that sustained resistance literally garnered land back. Like I forget the acres and stuff. I remember I wrote it down of how much land they actually obtained through that active project. But in my mind, as a scholar, my understanding is that that is the only project I feel that is Indigenous based that achieved land back in the Americas in that way, where they are openly saying it's an autonomous zone. Like I'm not aware of anybody else that could say that.
So if it is successful, of course, it's always going to be smeared and portrayed in a bad light because they did it.
Exactly. And you Google Zapatistas and you are going to see the guns, and you're going to see the masks. And I didn't see a gun when I was there. They didn't speak to how their military and their defense systems are structured. Again, security culture was there. I literally saw children playing. I literally seen people living and working the land, and having a sense of pride in that. But I mean, of course, there were social issues. Like, of course, there's a whole generation there that doesn't know or isn't conscious. How it was explained to me was they're not conscious of the struggle that led up to them being free. So, of course, there's like obviously kids who want to have the iPod, as David put it, but David being conscious of realizing with that iPod comes certain paradigms around capitalism that he doesn't want. Which just baffles me too, because it's almost like we were driving through one town, and Zapatista territory, it's not like one set territory. It's very fluid. So there's villages that identify as Zapatista villages, but you have to drive through villages and towns to get there. So there's literally like Zapatistas driving to get to other areas of their territory through regular towns and cities. And I remember talking to David, and I remember said, do you ever, like, where do you get your stuff from? Like, do you go to the store to buy groceries? Like, can you go to a gas station, get a pop and chips? And he said, yeah, you could, but he doesn't want to. And I was like, well, how do you get your stuff? And he says, well, I go through the Caracol system, and I'll put in a request for what I need, and they'll usually get me what I need. And of course, there's people who get cigarettes or smuggle a Coke or things like that. You know what I mean? Which is just human nature. But he said he consciously doesn't want to shop at the stores. And that just baffled me, because that's almost like consciously telling somebody, that's like me not consciously shopping at like the grocery store down the street, because I don't want to get involved with the capitalism that's involved there. So I would rather go to the farmer and get my produce directly. Like, that's how big of a paradigm shift they developed. And it's like literally telling people not to shop at Walmart, right? Like, even though the prices are cheap there, don't go there. And for him, that was an ingrained project.
Yeah, that's that national consciousness then that Fanon was talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And he did not want to compromise that. And I remember, in our belief system, we always bring gifts for people who host us. And I remember wanting to give him a gift, and the people whose homes we were staying in, and they said, no, I mean, we could take it, and but I'm going to take it to the Caracol, because I don't want, like he said, I don't want people to think that I'm benefiting from this relationship. We all should benefit from this relationship. So he took like the items of clothing and the gifts I gave him, like the multi-tool and things like that I had. He took it to the Caracol. And he said the Caracol will decide, the governance system will decide who needs this and where it's going to go.
So that's the governance system.
Yeah, the Caracol system is what they named the governance system.
So then your time there, you had a certain feeling.
Yeah, it definitely was. And again, like, when people, if I were to say like the average settler who was not conscious to hear me say this, I'm not advocating for violence. I'm not advocating for like the Zapatista mobilization. What stuck with me was the project they achieved, like the end outcome. And again, that's going to translate very differently wherever you go. But that sense of freedom and that, for lack of a better word, that liberty, like that sense of a true liberty, you know what I mean? Like an indigenous presence on their indigenous land to live, was really unique. Like if me being an indigenous person in my territory, if they asked me to stay and live there, I would seriously consider it. that was the depth of what I was feeling emotionally in that space.
It was like the most decolonized you've ever felt.
In a physical space.
Yes.
Yeah, in a physical space. And we didn't even talk about the politics. That's what was amazing about it. Like, we went down there to learn about governance systems and politics. And literally David was like, oh, just read the textbook. And we were having more fruitful conversations around, what it was like living there, what it was like for him to grow up in that setting and things like that. And a lot of like when we how it worked was we went to the Caracol and we got split up and sent to villages. So we were there in the villages for about a week. And then on the last day, we had to come back to the Caracol for the big gathering where everybody who was sent out came back into this Caracol. And there were going to be a celebration for the day, and we had to spend the night there. When we got back to the Caracol, and I was seeing sort of like leftists who were assigned to their guardians, their guardians were tired of them. Like, they were just like, okay, we're back, see you later, don't get into any trouble, and kind of just ditched them. But me and David, we stayed connected the whole time, and I met my brother and his guardian, and we stayed connected that whole time, and they were showing us around and talking to us about things. And one of the most interesting conversations I had was around one of these, the Zapatista dude who was assigned to take care of the water filtration system at the Caracol. And then we walked back there, and I said, can I look at the water system? Like, where does your water come from? Because I was hearing stories of the family who was watching me, how diarrhea was like killing people back in the 70s and in the 80s, and how water filtration was one of their main goals of Zapatista mobilizing. And I went there to visit the water filtration guy, and we had amazing conversations of like the heart he's putting into simply just running the water filtration system, and his whole political consciousness around how this water is literally feeding the people, nourishing the people, and is coming out of struggle. No one else was standing around there other than me and my brother and our two guardians and the water filtration guy. And he was more than happy to explain it to us because he could finally speak to his philosophy, obviously. And we were really curious to hear about it. But other people were there for the romanticization of Zapatistas, right? They were there to sort of like either hear about the politics or just be in that space and take their selfie, I found. But literally, like, one of the biggest changing points of my life also was not only watching children play, but visiting the water filtration guy at the Zapatista Caracol.
It was almost like going to another planet then, not in some kind of exotic fetishizing way, but what I mean is the default is so different from the colonial norms that we've talked about at the beginning of the podcast, that whatever we take as normal is actually rooted in colonialism, whereas everything there is rooted differently. And just being around in that space is just a completely different feeling, where then you don't even need to talk about politics per se explicitly. You have to talk about politics explicitly because you can't see the politics. Whereas here, you were just immersed in it. You were immersed in a new type of space, new type of politics, a new type of society.
Exactly. And it was like, and the best way I could explain it is like there was a sense of autonomy in everything they did. Like it wasn't something you were forced to do. It wasn't something that you had to do. It was something you wanted to do. And there's a freedom in that choice.
No duress.
Yeah, no duress. And of course, we heard about some social issues. Some people didn't like the Escalita model. Some people were very tense, and some people weren't open to conversations. And I respected that. Like, there was people in the villages who weren't open to visitors for very real reasons. But I mean, for the most part, what I witnessed and experienced, I haven't experienced or witnessed anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, we can't think of it as a monolithic thing either, that it's like everybody's the same. That's a mistake that people can make as well, especially I think when talking about Indigenous people, is to essentialize them and make them monolithic, when also within a shared experience and shared culture can be idiosyncratic and have their own views as well.
For sure. And to be honest, I mean, under the umbrella and the banner of Zapatista territory, it was a leftist project. And I acknowledge that fully in my discourse, in my relationship to political theory. And again, it was the most successful. And our guardians, like David was there until I walked on the bus to leave. Then he stood out and watched the bus leave. And that was the depth of the relationship we had. And I still pray for him. I still think about him, weekly. And a lot of times when I'm sitting and writing, I wonder what he's doing. I wonder where he's at. And, but I mean, he's not on social media. You know what I mean? I can't add him and check in or anything like that. But he's out there, living the life he wants to live, and him having the experience of observing the struggle and knowing why they do it. It's just like, it motivates me. Like I hope to meet him again one day.
Something else you discuss is positionality, a term you said that's used in Indigenous academia. So can you explain that for us?
Yeah, so I think for me, like in my undergrad, we had to do this writing exercise where we had to do our position statements, our positionality statements, and that's just sort of highlighting who we are, where we come from, and our relationship to the work we're doing. And that's always a tool that just stuck with me, and it's something that I always utilize in my work and even when I teach and instruct. But it's also a tool that I think academia is starting to utilize more in general, Indigenous academia, and I think I heard some lefties do it too, and I'm not too sure if they just picked up on it from Indigenous scholars. But yeah, positionality statement is just basically you positioning yourself. So like for me, I'm obviously like, you hear the trans community and queer theory utilizes it a lot with pronouns and identifying yourself in that way. So for me, like I'm definitely cisgendered hetero male, right? But at the same time, I'm Indigenous. I'm an Indigenous male, coming at it from a very specific geopolitical position. And I guess you probably could have heard that in my intro, as I was just positioning myself to the landscape, into our history.
At the outset, then, when I introduce you, and this is the way you normally introduce yourself, is as a Plains Cree Nakota from Poundmaker Cree Nation within Treaty 6 territory, that's your positionality.
For sure. And then, I mean, specifically even identifying the reserve as where I'm from may be different than somebody who positions themselves as coming from the urban center.
I see. So instead of like Western capitalist culture where we position ourselves or identify through our work, right? What do you do, right? Like you don't remember the person's name, but you know what they do. I'm a banker, or I'm an accountant, right? That's their, I guess, positionality. Whereas for you and in Indigenous academia, it's different. It's more talking about not only like geographic position, but where your ancestry comes from, where culture comes from. Instead of identifying via your work, you identify your work via where you came from.
And then you can also pick up on class, like you could pick up on even privilege if some people do it, right? Where they grew up, how they grew up. But it's really important to maintain that authenticity and that truth of people. And one of the interesting things I noticed too is like when settlers come to the conversation, or even like immigrants, I don't know if it's like a Western thing, but some people get offended when you ask where they're from or who they are or what their heritage is. And for good reason. I mean, a lot of white people, with Orientalism and things like that will make stereotypes. But for me, like as an Indigenous person, when I ask who somebody is, I really want to know who they are, so I could position them to the relationship I have with my land and territory that they're occupying or that they're in. So like for me to ask somebody who you are and where you come from, I wouldn't take that as rude, especially amongst Indigenous people, because we legitimately want to know who people are and where they come from, especially if they're, wanting to be a part of our community or be in our territory.
Well, that speaks to that trauma, right? Where in Indigenous culture, you're talking about something different, but in Western society, for a lot of immigrants, right? From that context, from white society, it's not talking about, oh, you can't say like I'm from the suburbs of blah, 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 right? They don't want to hear that. They want to use it to find out what country you're from and then essentialize you and say how you're the other, right? So then the experience of when that question is brought up, it comes with a lot of trauma and a lot of baggage, right? Whereas for me, if I'm in Korea, somebody asks that, that's a normal question. And that is how it's done in Korea. But when I get asked that and I'm not in Korea, it takes unpacking because I just think about where I am and I'm not thinking about who's asking me. So based on who I am, then I react to that differently because this is the society I live in. So I don't know where they're coming from. So because you do have non-white people use it in that colonizer way. So I guess it's like a defensive mechanism. You don't know. You don't know how they're coming at it. And you're already so like been abused by that question. Your first instinct is to be defensive. That doesn't even speak to you asking that question or the problem with that. It speaks to what we've already gone through.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, like the generic, I mean, if somebody's just coming at it from the surface level conversation, they'll say, oh, I'm Canadian, or I'm American, right? Or like, yeah. And people do stereotype for sure. But at the same time, for like Indigenous communities and culture, who we come from and our family systems and things like that, our last name, who our parents are, that's all very important positionality stuff that we always say when we introduce ourselves. When you ask settlers their positionality or who they are and where they come from, it's surface, but it could lead to an existential crisis for them. And again, that's part of the aspect of people having to unpack their emotional baggage.
What do you mean by existential crisis?
They don't know who they are. They don't know. They don't know who they are. They don't know where they come from. And a lot of them lost contact with, their heritage. And it sort of just gets tied into this settler colonial project that's really culturally ambiguous. And that's probably why it's almost rude now. They made it culturally relevant for it to be rude to ask who somebody is, simply because the majority of the culture and the Canadian project doesn't know who they are.
The directionality is always one way.
Exactly. And yeah, it leads to some very real issues that people have to unpack and begin to ask themselves that question. And a lot of my students who are really heartfelt and really connected and invested in the struggle tend to go on, their family origin stories to figure out who their family is and where they're coming from and things like that. And it works. Sometimes it takes up too much space, but I mean, I think that's a very important exercise and something that we have to recognize too with settlers is a lot of them don't know who they are, where they come from. And they don't even know like how to properly say their names anymore. Like, they'll have German last names or Ukrainian last names, but they've been changed. And, yeah, like it's really weird. Like one of the interesting things that comes up in our podcast is food. And how we're tied to food. We always ask questions about food. It came up in our little groupthink exercises that we should always talk about food because everyone loves food. But then when we realize with settlers, their relationship to food is really ambiguous or really cliche. Yeah.
You're actually speaking about kind of a back and forth I had with a good friend where I posted a meme making fun of white culture, making fun of their food, meaning they have no cultural food. And ultimately, the joke of the whole meme, and this is how my read of it and why I shared it, is there's no such thing as white society. It goes to what you were talking about, this existential crisis, because there is no white culture. There is no Judeo-Christian culture, right? Or whatever, like the new term du jour of the day. You have German culture, You have like Italian culture. You have Danish culture, right? But there's no homogenous white culture as there's no like homogenous indigenous culture as you talked about with the Zapatistas and your experience, right? But because white supremacists are saying it's whites against all of you miscellaneous people, then we bought into that narrative that there is a white society, there's a white culture. I mean, you could even say in American culture, Black people have Black history and Black culture because they don't get a voice and because they were forced to become a combined culture due to slavery and oppression. Same for many marginalized groups. But becoming one combined white culture due to being at the top or being supreme, what would you call that? So not knowing their positionality can cause a crisis, but pretending they have this homogenous, always explicitly unified white culture is actually purveying a supremacist myth.
Exactly. And the white settler state, like the creation of the settler state, right? Like, so like for somebody to say they're Canadian and how Canada's invested in this multicultural theory and the melting pot theory in the US, I think they call it, that sort of like uplifts that narrative because those are like creations of ways to sort of like avoid the conversation around positionality in context to history and identity, because people were coming here specifically to try and replicate some sort of concept of wealth. And so they kind of like avoid heritage and some generations, but then as they go back, it sort of starts to become clear that, yeah, you are German descent, right? You were like, your last name is Fleischmann, you were a butcher, and there's probably a story there tied to your ancestor. And it exists in very like philosophical ways for some people. But even like with the narrative of like white supremacy today, there is like a culture of trying to reclaim certain aspects of history. So obviously, like there's a very real reason why, you know, Nazi iconography is a part of that. You're seeing that sort of like with the Viking heritage now, right?
Where non-Vikings are saying they're Vikings, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then like it just doesn't speak to the truth of the history of what was actually taking place in Europe in like tribal eras and things like that. And yeah, so like white supremacy is even trying to invent the new culture with all like the Hollywood iconography and Hollywood philosophy of things. But even that's not true. So yeah, it kind of just gets into very real confusing areas for people. But the way I always position it, like if your audience wants to look into it for themselves of who they are and where they come from, they have to tie it to an ancestor. They have to tie it to somebody who was actually alive and trying to navigate life. And you know, obviously it's going to be led to an immigrant story or a story of struggle. And, you know, not to endorse any sort of like DNA sort of testing thing, because that's also very weird, but just to like authentically look at your family tree and ask yourself, what's your family of origin? What took place? What aren't we having conversations about? Who are we? And where do we come from? Because they're always trying to like reinvent identity and heritage, and it's just like it doesn't work. Like you can't do ancestry.com, that's just freaking weird. And then you can't do like just taking Western, you know, the tenets of like Viking culture or, you know, all this mainstream historical weird brand stuff and say, oh, that's who I am, because that's obviously white supremacy, right? And it's just, yeah, so just it leads a lot of young people that I work with into like this road of like, okay, well, what's going on? And then the way they navigate that is, like I said, they tie it to an ancestor. They tie it to somebody who they can go as far back to realize, oh, okay, this is my great-great-grandma, or this is my great-grandmother, or my great-grandfather. And it's sort of tied into, okay, now I could sort of begin to identify with this narrative and look at how much my family lost. Like, look at how much we've abandoned. And a lot of it's tied to food. Like, a lot of it's tied to family stories. A lot of it's tied to culture and things like that. Really interestingly enough, like we had a student, one of my colleagues had a student, her last name was Muller, and she wasn't aware that it was Mueller. It was a German last name.
Yeah.
Like things like that happen in the Americas that could probably only happen here. It just gets weird. And
Berkeley's another example where people who might have that last name might say it like that, but I think initially, like even UC Berkeley, the person who's named after is actually pronounced Barkley. So somewhere it got changed. I saw an MMA fighter recently talking about how a European fighter mispronounced their name, and that MMA fighter was like, no, I think that is actually the correct way to say my name. It's just that when my Italian family came here, they didn't want people to know they were Italian, so we started changing how you say it. But that European fighter, he said my name correctly. I guess ultimately, when we're talking about this existential crisis and somebody just says, I don't know, I'm white. If they mean by white, like is socially constructed and they don't know, then that is speaking to that reality that it is this constructed thing and maybe they've lost touch. But if they say I'm white and then they think that there's this white culture and white culture means enlightenment and it means humanism and it means we built this and that, then that's white supremacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
There could be, like to your point, German culture and, different types of European culture. But to that point also, then that could be like perversed into white supremacy again. It's constructed. One is constructed and you're recognizing that it's constructed, and the other one is constructed and trying to obfuscate that.
For sure. And then even like positionality statements could even like encompass the fact that people don't know.
Yes.
So for somebody to say, I don't know who I am, that's awesome positionality, because great, you're being authentic, you're being real with that. And that allows me to establish a relationship with you on that level. So yeah, not knowing is also knowing. And keep in mind, colonialism is replicated because you can't have a tied place to invest in a colonial project. You have to abandon it. So that's a very real outcome of colonization.
Yeah.
You got to abandon what you're connected to. You could be a colonizer any part of the world because you don't have sacred sites. You have to leave them.
Yeah.
And that's probably why, Christianity is tied to colonization, is because you could be Christian in any part of the world.
Yeah.
There's no specific land base that you're necessarily tied to, because you could erect a church everywhere you go. And that becomes the sacred site.
I think in this culture of capitalism and expertise, I think you're not allowed to say, I don't know, right? It doesn't value, I don't know. So I think that makes it even harder for people.
Yeah, one of my greatest mentors, Stephen Fanon, he's Mohawk. He was one of my undergraduate professors. He called on me in class to answer a question, and I didn't know the answer. And I literally said, I don't know. And I kind of just felt like shitty. But he validated that in that moment. He said, that's a very authentic thing to say. That's one of the best answers you could give, because the second you try to know something, you're already messed up, because you're not doing justice to answering the question. And that always stuck with me. So if somebody doesn't know who they are and they're going to just try and bullshit and create it, then that's more of an injustice, because it's a lie. You're lying.
Yeah.
And that's morally wrong, right? Like, you're completely lying now. So again, authenticity in terms of having some sort of moral compass, I think, is really important for people when they have these conversations around colonialism and colonization. Otherwise, you're investing into projects that aren't honest and truthful. And again, that's where the distrust and things happen.
And something else you just said that I think we need to define again is Mohawk. You know what that means, but for people, they might just think of it as a type of haircut. I'm serious. That's what people think. Yeah,
for sure. So he was Haudenosaunee from out east. That term sort of just generally speaks to Ongwe Putpo, who are indigenous to that territory. And again, I think that is also, I think, a Western term. I mean, a lot of my professors were actually descendants, are people. A lot of my professors are people from that area and territory that I've really been connected to. So yeah, that's probably why I just sort of threw that word out there.
It's a constructed term, but it is for a people. And then over time, that constructed term now doesn't even mean the people, it just means a haircut.
Yeah, for sure. So that's another example of
erasure.
Yeah, erasure, exactly.
You recently started a podcast. So can you tell us the name of your podcast and what it's about?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a few of us who came together to create a podcast, and it was just sort of just like a working joke over the past few years of, we'll one day have a podcast. But as we got older and sort of started to get more situated with our work and things like that, we realized we want to have more conversations with people. But because, we're getting more stationary and not in college and traveling the world as much as we would like right now, we decided to start the podcast, and we actually just launched it last month or in September. And it's called Radical Narrative. And basically what we're doing is we're just sitting down with people to have conversations and see who they are, where they come from, how they view the world, and trying to concentrate on solutions that the world needs. But again, it's if with what we talked about positionality, I like what comes to mind is that our podcast episodes are basically like positioning people, where they're speaking to how they're viewing the world and speaking to their positionality. And again, that's constructed. It's not like just a narrative podcast, like certain mainstream podcasts where they just sit with people and shoot the shit. We're actually trying to get outcome and foster growth for people to actually hear these things being talked about in a way where we're not positioning just theory. We're actually talking about navigating these things in real time from the perspectives of real people. But yeah, radical narrative, if people want to find it, it's RADICLE, radical. And that was also intentional. A radical is a botanist term. It's actually the point of a seed that begins to lay the roots. So again, fostering growth with these narratives and concentrating on the long-term game as opposed to just like the short-term game. So people tend to think it sounds like radical, like, you know, being the political activist type, but it's actually a little bit of creative words in play.
From our discussion, people know you're an experienced speaker, but as a newish podcaster, what are you learning from this experience? Because I think it's different for non-white podcasters as it is for white podcasters who have always had a voice.
Yeah. So for me, I mean, one thing, well, when we first started to do our like brainstorm a podcast, we definitely want to like build community. But we didn't realize how important that was until sort of like within the last probably year and a half, when you're sort of seeing far right media start to get out there, just in terms of, you know, the YouTube algorithms and things like that. And what really started to like concern me was when on Indigenous social media. So there's an Indian country that exists on social media, to be honest. Like Indigenous people in the Americas, we love social media. We love Twitter. We love Facebook. Those are like so much conversations happen on there. And I think even you being on my Facebook, I think you could kind of see too some of the humor and the politics that we share and that we put out there.
And it's growing big on TikTok, actually.
Yeah, and actually, I think TikTok has sort of exposed non-Indigenous people to sort of like our humor and our culture and how we do things. So it's an amazing thing. Like I think the whole dog face TikTok, you know, the guy drinking cranberry juice riding his skateboard, that was really popularized and sort of just took off. And then people just start to find, you know, other TikTok people who are starting to put stuff out there. So yeah, it's really showing like our community and our humor and our politics and things like that. Because a lot of that message is political. Like a lot of that has political undertones and things like that. But what was concerning for me was I started to see on Facebook people starting to share videos that were tied to far right politics. People that are sharing content that was racist, ultimately racist towards like immigrants and refugees and
people as in Indigenous people.
Yeah, as an Indigenous people, you know, just clicking share. I don't like, I feel like a lot of them weren't fully conscious of the origins of some of the content. So like, that sort of making its rounds and then having to call that out and then recognizing also like with the invention of the podcast, what was concerning for me, to be honest, is I also work on a mental health team in a local school. And so children, you know, make their way to the computer lab. They love computer. Children love YouTube in general, but Indigenous children love YouTube in general. Like it's amazing how much like they're into it and they figure things out. Like what's interesting, a story I tell is I was working with a young Indigenous student in middle school who figured out how to light his grandma's pilot light for her furnace by YouTubing it. So like that's sort of like the level of like children are accessing this tech, which is pretty obvious probably across the board. But what was concerning for me was walking into the computer room and seeing certain podcasts and seeing certain content on history channels on the history of YouTube that, you know, middle school students were watching and that high school students were watching. And I think that was concerning for me because I was like, okay, this politics and the conversation that's taking place on this content isn't about us and it's not for us. But then they're getting access and exposed to that. So having conversations with friends and other people about how we need more Indigenous media, we need more Indigenous podcasts, we need more Indigenous like social media outlets that are putting out quality content that represents us, that is for us, and could critique some of those counter narratives that exist against us. I think that was the wake-up call for me, was actually seeing people find their way to certain podcasts and tell me about podcasts where I know the politics aren't sound and I know the content is inherently racist. And, you know, them being young teenagers who are growing up watching these podcasts, I was like, nah, that you gotta like approach that critically. So that was the big turning point for me where I said, okay, well, let's just do the podcast. And we decided to put the podcast out there.
And I think this is like back to the point about national consciousness, where people want to just like reduce it all away and have this united solidarity. We're all just one people, even like leftists, right? We're just workers and it's us versus them. From a colonial perspective, there's exploitation happening where they're extracting from you, but it's not coming back to you. So it's just money being pulled out from your society or from your community, right? It's extraction. Whereas national consciousness or doing stuff by you, for you, is then about like keeping that energy, not just money, but energy, attention still within that community and not being extracted out. You're making stuff for yourself. So unless we have a utopia, we have to think about these things from that national consciousness perspective, this perspective of within communities, and thinking of things from a post-colonial struggle perspective.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like a lot of the content that is generated tends to sort of like just critique us, or not critique us, but portray us in very negative ways. Like talking about that mainstream podcast and how I was talking about Indigenous people, but knowing that Indigenous young people were listening to that podcast, I think that was like what really pissed me off the most at that point. Whereas like, yeah, this is garbage, and now we have students listening to it.
It gives you more work to do because now you got to unpack more stuff like that stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And we're doing that in the chaos of like a colonial world where, you know, students and young people and our listeners are navigating these in real time. So yeah, we take that into consideration when we sort of construct who we're going to get on a podcast. And again, it's intentional. Like we're actually constructing the message we want to get out there, even though when people listen to the podcast, it's a narrative. But we're actually like hitting a lot of things on the head when people, listen to it. And we do get feedback from people who realize we're doing that. Like I was sitting with a friend of mine, Anthony Price, who was one of my students that I TA'd for. And people simply said, I never heard a native talk to a white guy in that way before with that tone. And like that's very decolonial. Like that's what we were going for, was we wanted people just to hear us have this conversation and critique these things without either one of us taking things personally, and just being able to humorously have a conversation about that stuff and unpack that. So that was a success. Like things like that is like, we want to talk about settler colonialism, but we're not going to jump into a lot of like what we talked about here, which works for a certain audience, but we also want to make it like accessible to people to feel what we're saying and talking about, and then being able to put that theory or that terminology or that label to the conversation post fact. It's almost like we're creating like a syllabus, and the podcasts are the readings for that syllabus, if that makes sense.
No, it does, because you're thinking about it from a series of conversations and like kind of walking people through, not just from one episode, but from like hoping that they subscribe and keep listening, and then from there you could get them into ideas that they couldn't get to in one episode, right? Whereas what we're having is more like a crash course, and even this is like part of a bigger meta topic. Because I do think of all of these conversations as building, right? There's a reason why I waited to have a conversation about colonialism. And you might have even seen some comments I made in some of the Southpaw groups where it's like, I waited a year to talk to you guys about colonialism because you guys weren't ready a year ago, right? So I think of it in that way. But specifically to what you're doing, getting people to think about things that maybe they're not ready to talk about or think about in one conversation, but over a series, they could go very far.
Yeah, and that's definitely the goal. Is there's a strategic outcome we want to reach with it. But again, like when people listen to it, we're only 4 episodes in, but we're scheduled to do 10 total for our first season. And we basically take these concepts and try and find the person we could interview who could speak about those things without speaking about those things. So it's kind of like there's kind of another degree of planning that goes into it. But yeah, we're gonna probably end off this first season with 10 episodes and try get to December and do a Christmas break, and then jump into season 2 after the holidays, and then try and do another 10 that gets us to summer. But yeah, welcome to building the Radical Narrative family. So any of your listeners who want to tune in, they're welcome to.
Do you feel like podcasting is a way to continue the oral tradition?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's Indigenous podcasters out there who have been doing this for some time and have even launched podcasts, and they're out there, and no longer add to them, but they're out there. There's definitely like this relationship to oral history where we're having conversations about culture and history for sure. So yeah, it definitely continues on that. I think Indigenous media in general is doing amazing things. Like I went to an arts college, like even though I was in the academic track of Indigenous liberal studies, I went to school with a lot of like visual artists and new media artists, and just seeing like the content come out where we're sort of picking up these tools and creating our own content is really cool to see. So for sure, like, we're definitely bringing cultural aspects to the mediums that we're utilizing. And yeah, it definitely is a continuation of who we are. And ultimately it is naturally simply because it's a representation of who we are. So yeah, even though it's not necessarily like may sound cultural per se, it definitely is representative of who we are when it's coming from an Indigenous artist or an Indigenous person who's putting their intention into it.
This is probably one of my favorite podcasts I've done. I've learned so much because this is a topic I've been waiting to do, and I was looking for the right person, and not just somebody with knowledge. There's knowledgeable people out there, but also somebody where we could have a conversation where it's like comfortable, right? Going back to horizontal, right? As much as we can, and be willing to engage in this in a format where we're not tourists. I mean, we are tourists, but really at least frame things not in that way and really try to immerse ourselves in a different way to look at things from the Indigenous perspective and from a post-colonial struggle perspective. So thank you so much for coming on the show and talking with us.
Yeah, no problem. I'm really excited to see how this translates to your audience and to lefties in general, because I think, it's a curveball for some people, and just to be open to wherever it takes you, because I mean, North America is Indigenous land. It's an Indigenous Americas. One thing I would encourage your listeners to do also is to just look at, just as an exercise, look at like how much Indigenous foods have contributed to the cuisine of the world. And then you're going to see how much we've been left out of the conversation, how much we've been left out of everything. But now we're sort of approaching a day where we're, asserting ourselves. And I always say that's going to be amazing, because it's only going to, lead to more truth telling, lead to better structuring of how the world's going to function.
I hope this episode actually makes people uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
We here in the US, we are on Indigenous land that was taken. And so there's a lot of discomfort that we should sit with and self-reflect. So I'm hoping that this causes discomfort, and people take the time then to sit with that discomfort and do the internal work. And then from there, hopefully work through a lot of trauma, a lot of internalized colonialism, not even as, Indigenous person who might be listening, but also as a settler or a colonizer or somebody who's just non-white listening to this, and do that internal work that, maybe people have been avoiding or thought that political work is secular to internal work, where you have to address, is this about my own personal reaction towards my family or things that happen to me personally? Or is it actually about greater politics and about the world I want to live in? So I hope this actually causes a good kind of discomfort, because discomfort can also be good, right? And to your point that you kept bringing up is emotional intelligence, something that hopefully makes us more emotionally intelligent. And something that I've been talking to a lot of fellow Southpaw members about, because we are engaged in combat sports, is radical softness, like learning to come at things trauma-informed, care-informed, right? So I hope it does a lot of those types of things with people, and people just sit with this episode.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the reality with decolonial conversations is they're unsettling. If you're not unsettled, then it's not a decolonial conversation. So, I mean, I'm hoping it does elicit that type of response where people could dive into the inquiry. And let me know how it goes. And of course, I follow Southpaw. I listen. I follow you guys, and I see some of the comments you get in general, and I'm really interested to see how this translates to everybody else, all your listeners in your community.
So, where can people find you and your podcast?
Yeah, so you can find our podcast wherever you get podcasts. It's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. We have a website, www.radicalnarrative.com, that just sort of links you to the profiles of our guests and has the anchor attachment to that, so you can listen there. So you can follow us on Instagram also. We have an Instagram, The Radical Narrative. Again, RADICLE. You could follow me on Instagram, Mylan Murdo. Facebook, if you could find me. But yeah, I'm out there.
I'll actually put all that in the show notes so it's easier for people to find.
Yeah, for sure. And then also, I mean, I know you have a really cool mixed martial arts community, and we do some nonprofit work. And I know we were talking about you getting up here too, after COVID subsides. So we're definitely open to having conversations with people who want to do any sort of solidarity work or any sort of self-defense stuff too.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, Mylan.
Thanks, Sam.
Now that's the show. If you enjoyed this episode and find this type of independent media worthwhile, please consider supporting the show on Patreon. We have a lot more episodes like this one in the works, but need your financial support to keep the show running. Even a few dollars a month goes a long way. No one does what we do, and it's all being funded by you, the listener. In return for supporting us, you'll gain access to lots of bonus content along with our private Discord chat. Even if you can't support us, there's a lot of free bonus content there as well. We also have an online store if you want to show your Southpaw solidarity by wearing our swag. You can find all pertinent links at southpawpod.com. And if you can't afford to support the show and still want to help, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. This makes it easier for others to find us. And don't forget to share your favorite episodes or the podcast itself on social media. Tell your friends. Until next time, goodbye.
Southpaws, hitting with the left. Southpaws. Sam. Paul. Southpaw.